On the line with us is Professor Stephen Cohen. He is the contributing editor to The Nation magazine, professor emeritus of Russian Studies and Politics at NYU and Princeton. You can read his work at thenation.com. His most recent book, Soviet Fates and Lost Alternatives, which examines the new Cold War, as it were, is now available in paperback. Professor Cohen, welcome back.
Thank you, Tom.
Even though we booked this several days ago, today seems astonishingly auspicious for you and I to be having this conversation. The news reports.
You have a nose for the news, Tom.
I guess, or the universe has conspired. Whatever. What are your thoughts on first of all the news of the day? You know that Russia is bombing inside Syria for the first time, and that John McCain is going on the floor of the Senate screaming about it.
Undoubtedly, on Monday, September 28th, when Putin and Obama met privately, Putin told Obama this was going to happen. So we really have to go back to what the two men did and said at the UN 2 days ago on Monday, because the two spoke publicly. And I can't think in recent years of a time when a Russian leader and an American leader spoke on the same venue, essentially two others, in front of hundreds of people, and then by television, millions of people, in such a conflicting, candid, stark way. It was all there. Yeah. The two views of international relations, the two views of American and Russian foreign policy, the two views of the crisis not only in Syria and Iraq, but also in Ukraine, the two views of who's responsible for the new Cold War, and the two views about what's to be done. Now, after those two meetings, they met privately, Putin and Obama. And top leaders, when they have these private meetings, never tell us what they really said. They both spin it or give us a lacquered version. But I think what we saw at the UN on Monday was extremely important, because we're at a fateful moment. And the conflict, the basic conflict between the United States and Russia, was spelled out not by propagandists, but by the two leaders. So maybe you want to spend a couple minutes just rehearsing what they said to each other publicly.
Okay. What would that be?
Well, they all focused on Ukraine, but primarily Syria. They both did.
Right.
And Obama said, and this is what Bill Clinton said, and this is what George Bush said, this is what Obama says, is that what we do in areas like the Middle East is we bring democracy. We're a democracy promoting government, and that informs and drives our foreign policy. This is the official view. What we do in the dark is another matter. But that we are a virtuous people, and we're carrying that virtue to other countries to bring them, those regions, democracy and a better life. And though this isn't said so clearly, it's plain that sometimes this means regime change, that we seek to overthrow an established authoritarian government or leader, either by surreptitious means, of which we have many, as do many governments, or by military attacks, which we've done many times, and that this is the way it should be. And Putin directly answered that. He said, you're doing what the Soviet Union did. In the name of an ideology, you are violating international rules about territorial sovereignty. For example, you have no right to be bombing in Syria. You have permission from the Iraqi government. You don't have permission from the Syrian government or from the UN. And you've done this before. And the reality is, says Putin to Obama, mind you, they're not face-to-face, but they're speaking within an hour of each other at the same venue, the UN. What you've really done is bring greater tyranny in the form of these terroristic movements and manyfold more human misery. And he uttered a line that resonates and that we ought to listen to, but we won't, or maybe we will. He said, addressing the United States and Obama, do you now realize what you have done? And he was referring to the ISIS state, which he sees as primarily our inadvertent creation. by toppling regimes. Now, underlying this, Tom, is a very important point in general, that if you destroy a statehood of a country, that whether it's ruled by a dictator or a democrat, institutionalizes the long history, traditions, religions, social makeup, culture of that country, you create a vacuum. And what, says Putin, do you think is going to fill that? And he didn't say this, but evidently we Americans think that, oh, well, maybe Bill Clinton or Bernie Sanders will become the president of Syria. But no, the rulers emerge from that region. And the alternative in Damascus today, says Putin, to Assad, which we want to overthrow, is ISIS, the Islamic State. So that's the two conflicting foreign policy views set out. Now, we ought to be having, at this moment, as you and I talk, because it was framed in a way that maybe it's never ever been framed, even when the Soviet Union exists, a big debate right now in this country about whether Putin was right or wrong. And it ought to, of course, fill into our so-called presidential debates, Democratic and Republican. And it has only obliquely, because as usual, Donald Trump wants to talk about it and says something different. But that's the stark thing. Now, the Russian position, and this brings us to the news today, is that Assad is not the enemy. He's part of the solution, at least for now. It's only his Syrian army that's fighting effectively against the Islamic State. Therefore, we Russians are now, in some limited military way, going to go to the military rescue of Assad while striking the terrorist armies that are operating in Syria. Immediately, of course, McCain, the New York Times, the White House protested and said this was bad because the Russian attacks on these terrorist movements are going to perpetuate Assad's rule in Damascus and make everything worse. But that's the debate. That's where things stand. And, you know, Putin offered a coalition. But note this, Tom, and I'll stop with this. He said, essentially, we want to form a grand coalition with the United States against this terrorist evil in the Middle East and elsewhere. And think of it, said Putin, as when the Soviet Union and the United States united against Hitler. He actually used that analogy. And we should think about that too. But here's the reality. Putin had already formed such a coalition. And think of the states he's brought into this coalition to fight ISIS, publicly and off the record. Of course, Iran and Iraq, of course. But also Israel. Israel's joined in. Saudi Arabia already joined in. That is, these are American allies and other countries. So my view is, though this is not being said in the United States, is that the coalition is a train that's left the station. And Obama was asked by Putin, in more polite terms on Monday, do you want to get on the caboose? For our younger listeners who don't know what the caboose is, that's the car at the end of the train. But this train's left the station, and it was signified dramatically this morning when Russian warplanes began to strike inside Syria with the permission of the Syrian government at both our so-called moderate rebels, it's dubious whether they are that, and at ISIS depots and formations.
Right. It's a remarkable moment in history. We're talking with Professor Stephen Cohen, a contributing editor with The Nation, Professor Emeritus of Russian Studies and Politics at NYU and Princeton, author of Soviet Fates and Lost Alternatives, now out in paperback, the book that examines the new Cold War. We'll be right back with more of our conversation with Professor Cohen right after this.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
And you can read Professor Cohen's works at thenation.com. Welcome back. 15 minutes past the hour. We're talking to Professor Stephen Cohen. Professor, on Monday, I was in New York at the United Nations. I wasn't in the room for the speeches by President Obama and President Putin. I was on a train, but I listened to them on my iPhone on my Sirius app, and I got that, and then I was interviewed on RT that night about what I thought was going to come out of all this, and I said, I have no idea, but my hope would be that Obama could save face, and that Putin could, and that Putin could save it. That both of them could get, that they could compromise somehow, and that what seemed to me a reasonable compromise is that Russia would agree that over a period of some years, the Assad government is going to be replaced by a government elected by the people. But first, we've got to deal with this ISIS problem. And I also pointed out that there's no discussion in the American press about the fact that Russia has a naval base and an air force base in Syria, and they're there at the pleasure of the Syrian government. I mean, they have a legitimate interest in the region. And if our military bases in Qatar were being threatened by ISIL, we would not be sitting around having a discussion about whether the Qatari government was ethical. We would be bombing the hell out of ISIL. And so anyhow, your thoughts on my thoughts.
Your thoughts are correct. And we would only add that Russia's relationship with Syria is very long and very intimate. Russia was the primary military ally of Assad's father. Certainly before you began doing what you're now doing, and when I sort of started out. Mm-hmm. So it's not as though Russia suddenly looked at a map and said, gee, Syria, and oh yeah, we have this ticky-tack Mediterranean naval base there, which has got one gas pump and two guys with a pistol, and we never use it. No, this is an intimate relationship. Russia's been involved in Syria, and Syria with Russia, for decades. And one of the results, because when we begin to think about politics, and particularly geopolitics, we forget the human binds. There are many intermarried Syrians and Russians. There are many Russian men went to Syria as trainers and minders and suppliers and teachers over the decade, and married Syrian women, had children, and they live in Russia. But many were left behind, and Russia has evacuated many of them. Russia, by the way, is very good at evacuation. You may remember, was it 2 years ago, when they did a very large evacuation of their people from Libya, but brought a number of Americans who were endangered out as well. So they've got to be mindful of the security of their people there. But this is a long relationship. On the question of whether Obama and Putin can now work together and bring the people, the countries that they lead or represent with them to a grander coalition, comes down to an old-fashioned word that we talk about and kind of degrade in the United States, but leadership. They have to rise. And the first thing they have to decide is what, in terms of my national security, Russia's and America, is the first priority. And I would agree with you, Tom, that in my judgment, maybe this is overstated, this Islamic movement is the worst evil and also the most contagious and the most inflationary and growing evil in the world today. And look at what it's creating for Europe.
It's a disaster in Germany right now. I was there just 2 weeks ago. And we'll be right back. Professor Stephen Cohen with us. Stick around. It's 20 minutes past the hour. Thom Hartmann here with you. Professor Stephen Cohen on the line with us. We're talking about Russia as Syria, the United States, Presidents Putin and Obama. Stephen, where do you see this playing out? What are your best hopes and greatest fears?
My best hopes, you articulated, that Obama and Putin and their advisors, because neither man proceeds without consultation with his military intelligence and political aides. And yes, there is a politics around Putin. He has a problem politically in Moscow. In a word, the ultra-nationalists are convinced that Putin is about to sell out Ukraine in return for Syria with Obama. They have this view that Putin is not a resolute leader and that he will give up their ethnic countrymen and women in Donbass, in Ukraine, in return for protecting Assad and a Russian role in Syria. That will not happen, but that's a real politics in Moscow. But my hope is that, as you said, Tom, so well, that they will rise above themselves, as real leaders do, and form a substantial coalition. Now, there's a lot to be worked out. When you have a coalition, who leads, who's sitting at the head of the table, are there co-heads and the rest? Let's say this happens. Let's say a real military political coalition to defeat Islamic State in Iraq and in Syria develops. But Tom, let's be realistic, because you do politics and I do politics, though in different ways. You do it better, I follow it. There are enormous obstacles. The first one you mentioned, there's going to be tremendous opposition in Washington. Obama is going to be accused of appeasing Putin, who is often referred to by McCain and even Mrs. Clinton as a kind of Hitler. So Obama will have to deal with that opposition. And in international affairs, he's not been very good at that. He tends to bend and then capitulate, maybe for the sake of his domestic agenda, maybe because he really doesn't have a good grasp or a good vision when it comes to international relations. So we will see what happens in Washington, whether Obama can actually do this and reach out and join with Putin. But there's another problem. There's also such a politics in Moscow, and that's the Ukrainian crisis. It could flare up in any moment in a way that could disrupt any fragile agreement between Putin and Obama. And I think that the United States-backed government or regime in Kiev is so worried about the possibility of this kind of cooperation between Moscow and Washington in the Middle East that Washington may kind of forget Ukraine or lessen its commitment to the Kiev government. So I would not be surprised, not because I'm a conspiracy theorist, but because this always happens in Cold War, and we're in a Cold War, that Kiev stages a provocation to inflame the crisis, which is at a rather low level at the moment in Ukraine, and therefore redoubles the opposition in Washington to any rapprochement between Obama and Putin. And by the way, if the Kiev government does that, it will make Putin's position in Moscow all the more difficult. So I would say that we can hope, but as Reagan used to say, we ought to verify, and in this case, we ought to also see the obstacles.
Yeah. So the last time you and I talked, you were very concerned that we were looking at trigger to World War III kind of events. Are you still thinking that?
Well, we were talking at that time about Ukraine.
Yes.
And I have been arguing since you and I began nearly 2 years ago, I think, Tom. I mean, we talked before, but we began on a regular basis that the civil war in Ukraine, which is what it is, not primarily a Russian invasion, a civil war, had become a proxy war between the United States and Russia, with Russia supporting the rebels in Donbass and we supporting the government in Kiev. And when you have a proxy war, if that escalates, it becomes a Cuban Missile Crisis. So that was my concern. I am a little less concerned today, but only a little, because all the objective factors and subjective factors in the leadership in Ukraine and in Moscow and in Washington remain the same. That is, people like McCain continue to say we should be arming the Ukrainian government much more fully so they can fight more effectively, which runs the risk of bringing the Russians in a serious way. And then we would be in a Cuban Missile Crisis situation. Now we have the Syrian thing. And I mean, this is serious. And everybody, I mean, my young kids, my grandkids would understand this. If American warplanes, Russian warplanes, Syrian warplanes, French warplanes, I think maybe Israeli warplanes, are all flying over Syria and Iraq, they got to be careful they don't shoot each other down. I mean, this is a very difficult, complex, technical situation beyond my understanding and yours, except that we know this really has to be coordinated. Somebody said the other day, I think an American official, no matter what the Russians do, the moment their aircraft are in the air, and so are ours, I think this was Petraeus actually briefing Congress, because suddenly he's back as a big authority on all this stuff. I think because his not very successful experiences in Afghanistan seemed to make him a great advisor on what we ought to do in Syria.
Right.
I'm not sure that's the way we should go, but, you know, Washington likes familiar faces,
Right.
and they don't want to hear outside views, so let them do what they do. But Petraeus said, we don't want somebody shooting at the wrong target.
Right.
And the possibility of that happening is great.
So
Imagine what would happen if the Russians inadvertently shot down an American warplane or vice versa. Then the political pressure in Moscow and Washington would really be on the leadership to retaliate. So what we now have, let me sum this up. We have a Cold War that's become a proxy war, but it's now on two fronts. It's Ukraine and in the air or on the ground over Syria in regard to the Islamic State. So here's a chance for cooperation. In the old Cold War, the 40-year Cold War, this often happened. It was full of conflict, but we found ways to cooperate, and it was managed because of the rules. The problem is there are no rules to it.
Yeah, and that's a very, very big problem. Professor Cohen, thank you so much for being with us today.
Thanks, Tom.
Very important and thoughtful conversation, and it's always great to get your input. Thank you very much. Professor Stephen Cohen, check out his book, Soviet Fates and Lost Alternatives. You can read his writings at thenation.com.